Hi, it's Deborah Hamilton, and today I have the honor of speaking with Amanda Ripley, who's become a really great friend. She's the author of High Conflict, a phenomenal book that everyone should read who might be in conflict over animals. It's applicable to those conflicts as well. And she is also, along with her colleague Helene, having podcasts and trainings under the title of Good Conflict. So you can go to Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, look for Amanda Ripley or Good Conflict and look at the different videos that she puts up and information that she puts up to help you navigate conflicting times. So let's hear what Amanda and I speak about today. Hi, I'm Deborah Hamilton. Welcome to my podcast, Why Do Pets Matter? 10 years ago, with my iPhone and a script, I recorded the first episode of the Ultimate Pet Resolution Summit, which chatted with experts about conflicts over animals. Our conversations were intimate, honest, and illustrated how disagreements over animals occur and how those disagreements can reshape people's lives and relationships. In November 2019, I started Why Do Pets Matter, a new podcast that continued these informative discussions. I'm so excited to have you here with me, continuing my exploration into a more meaningful conversation about why pets matter to all of us. My guests and I will share ideas, stories, and experiences straight from the heart, unscripted and holistic. From the bravest moments to the most brokenhearted, we will explore how to resolve disagreements over animals differently. One thing I know for sure is I want to have more meaningful conversations that will help all of us unlock that deeply felt human-animal bond that drives the emotions of conflict. Hi, everyone. Deborah Hamilton and Why Do Pets Matter? I'm here with my new friend, and I'm so glad to have her as a friend, Amanda Ripley. She's the author of High Conflict, one of my favorite books in the world. And she also has started trainings under the title of Good Conflict. You can find them on Instagram, you can find them on YouTube, on LinkedIn. I watch them and comment on them all the time. We'll probably talk about one of the best ones that I really felt was phenomenal during our talk today, but maybe not. You know, I only ask one question and we go from there. So Amanda, thank you so much for being here on Why Do Pets Matter?
So I'm very excited to be here, Deborah. Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed all of our talks and I always learn from our conversations. So I can answer for me. I mean, pets matter because they bring out, I think, some of our most childlike wonder and our sense of affection and warmth and curiosity and so many of our best qualities as humans. Not always, right? They can bring out our worst, and we should talk about that for sure. But I think there's something uniquely human, ironically, about the delight that we take in our relationships with our pets, right? Sometimes we take it too far, let's be honest, but but that's also a human thing. So yeah, that would be my answer.
It's so perfect that you brought that up because what's going through my mind now is the quote from Roger Karras, pets don't make us whole, but pets are not our whole life, but they make our lives whole.
Oh, I love that. Exactly.
That was his when he was at Westminster and he used to be the voice of Westminster. He used to say that all the time when he began because pets really do make our lives whole. They're the glue that hold us together when the ups and downs come, right?
Right, right. And we
Yeah.
need that. Yeah.
And our pets, of course, I have something in my desk that I would show you, but it says that I just would like to live up to the person my dog thinks I am.
Exactly.
Because he really thinks I'm pretty super special. I've been away for 10 days and when he no well, it takes them a while. It's really weird. They come up, they sniff you, they look at you and go, "Oh, it's a visitor." And then they go, and you can see, "Oh shoot, mom's home." And the two of them went berserk because I
Ah,
for
nice.
10 days. So it was really fun to have them. And I'm so glad you brought that up because it really is part of what create and here he is creates our love of pets and why pets matter to us. So you and I have talked at length about conflicts, and we actually had a little bit of a podcast kind of piece on good conflict, talking about how people argue over pets. And you were sort of fascinated with, oh my God, people really get that angry over pets?
Yeah, I loved the idea of, first of all, I often find that it's easier for us to talk about human to human conflict if we come at it sideways through talking about some particular kind of conflict or something that might seem kind of light and fun, but actually isn't. So there's a whole category of conflict mediators, as you may know, Deborah, who specialize in tree conflict. So this is neighbors having fights over trees, like trees getting cut down, trees blocking views, trees, I mean, endless, right? And it's a really nice way in to the larger question of how do humans behave in conflict? How can they behave better in ways that makes conflict useful and interesting as opposed to destructive? So likewise, when we first met and I learned that you specialize in mediating conflict around animals, that was so fun because again, it makes us all kind of curious, which is how we want to be in conflict and often aren't, right? And although I know that conflict can get quite ugly, no matter what the subject, including when it's around pets, there's something just a little bit more accessible about talking about that than just talking about, violent conflict or war or, gang violence or some of the things that I talk about in other contexts. So yeah, I was really intrigued to hear about the patterns that you noticed in the cases that you've worked with. That often it sounded like conflict was some of the patterns where conflict is often between veterinarians and the pet owners, right? Mm-hmm. Or between neighbors over pets, that makes sense, or between couples who are splitting up over who gets custody of the pet. I think those were the big three. Am I missing any?
Breeders and their owners.
That's right. There was a lot of conflict with breeders.
They really never let go. I can raise my hand and say I'm one of them. In fact, people who buy my Irish setters always say, you lend them to us.
Yes. So it's like a complicated relationship, it sounds like.
Really good breeders, it really is. And they need to learn how to be more resilient and be not only a mentor, but a mentee, because everybody cares for a dog differently. And that doesn't make it wrong. You might
right.
And I laughed when you said the people who handle tree disputes. I would love to talk to them because they probably come up with the same issues I have.
Yes, that would be so fun. You should have one of them on your podcast. Oh, I want to listen to that. Right. And then are there other categories? I mean, there's obviously labor disputes, divorce lawyers and divorce mediators, but there must be other fun ones like conflict over, what would be another one? Trees, pets.
Well, I'm trying to make it part of the environmental law, so that people who are tree huggers talk to people who are lumberjacks, right?
Yeah.
Here we are talking, and that's sort of a little bit further than the neighbor with the tree, rather the neighbor with a million trees.
Right.
And then the amount of animals that are impacted by, so you have the environmentalists who say, well, if we do this, it'll make the environment better. And then you have the environmentalists who say, no, it won't make it's
right.
In every facet of life. If you could, and we've talked about this, if you could teach people how to breathe, and as they're breathing, listen. And I don't know how you feel. I think you probably feel the same. If we could only just find ourselves when we are triggered.
Yeah. The emotional regulation is such a big part of it, right? And we're not really typically taught that, but that is at least half the battle, right?
I would like to volunteer that I'm learning. I'm still learning.
Same, always, till the day I die. I hope I'll keep learning, yeah, because it's not easy.
It isn't easy, and people think that being a mediator, we're going to be able to find a resolution to things, or help people find the resolution to things. And I'd love to hear your feeling, because you trained with the same people I trained with for mediation, which you took into journalism. And I love the thoughts that you brought along, because it was, what are we doing? And how can we do it in a way that might be less defensive and reactive? At least that's what I took away from the book High Conflict.
Yeah, so a lot of that book was really inspired by conflict mediators like yourself and doing training with Gary Friedman in particular at the Center for Understanding and Conflict, which we have in common, I believe. And that really opened my eyes to, there were just so many things about conflict and human behavior in conflict that I had not understood. Like just as an example, I remember when I went to do his week-long training years ago, he said, almost offhand, he said, well, blame is usually a mask for vulnerability. And then he kept talking. And I remember thinking, oh, really? I just didn't know that. And once you know that, you start noticing when you are blaming others, when they're blaming you. And not that there's never any accountability that needs to be met, right? But it's sort of like really chronic blame as a kind of state is usually protecting something. And it's helpful to know that, right? I mean, so it was like this whole underbelly of conflict that I hadn't understood. And then, Gary being Gary, he was also vulnerable and revealed that he had run for local office in his town in California and that it was not going well. And that, as he put it, it took him about an eighth of a second to get sucked into high conflict himself, despite his literally having mediated thousands and thousands of cases involving really difficult conflict, writing books, training thousands of people like you and me. It didn't matter because we're all susceptible to high conflict. It's very, very magnetic. And so he allowed me to sort of follow him through that and write about how he got himself out of high conflict in local politics in California, which, it's not everyone who would let you do that. I mean, it was an extraordinary thing to reveal that the thing that was most core to your lifelong accomplishments, you were suddenly really struggling with, which is how to hold on to your self and regulate your emotions and be the person you want to be, even when you're feeling attacked, which is very, very challenging.
It was so great when I read the book and I read the part about Gary, because Gary is the reason I do mediation of conflicts over animals, because when I studied with him, like you did for the 40-hour program and then beyond, I'm sort of like a groupie.
Yeah, me too.
Fangirl. I said to him, I'd like to do this. And he goes, well, why not? And I said, well, nobody's doing it. And he goes, great. And I didn't realize at the time in 2010 that it would take me 14 years to get a little bit of traction going. I had traction, I think, but not the kind of traction you hope for, or you would get, say, if you were an employment mediator,
right,
divorce mediator, because that's a venue in which mediation is recognized.
Right. It's like become integrated into the norms. Yeah.
And when you brought it into another venue, which would definitely not necessarily be open,
right,
it must have been sort of the same as what I had, which was great, wonderful, but it won't work for me.
Yes, yeah. I ended up writing about Gary and others in an essay about how journalists could cover conflict differently based on what mediators could teach us, as you mentioned, and then we got a really surprisingly strong positive reaction from a lot of people, many of them not journalists. So I was sort of surprised how interested non-journalists were in reading about how journalists could cover conflict better. And then some journalists as well. So then we started being asked to do workshops about that. So my co-founder, Helene Bianduti-Hofer, spent a couple of years with the Solutions Journalism Network building out a curriculum for newsrooms. Okay, how can we cover controversy and division in ways that are useful and still interesting and engaging, right? But are different than our normal ways. And, you would get some people who got it right away. They were super leaned in. They wanted every kind of resource and idea. They were really just so energized, right? And I'm sure you've seen this too, by the idea of doing this differently, because it had bothered them for a long time, the way we were covering conflict in traditional journalism. And then there were other people who just, it bugged them on some kind of primal level, because it felt contrary to some of the core sacred values of journalism, which include, a sort of, let's not say objectivity, because I think that's gone by the wayside for most journalists. They no longer believe there's such a thing as objectivity, although audiences would very much like there to be. But the idea that you're kind of a neutral, aloof witness to the terrible things that happen in the world, and it's not up to us to help people make conflict useful. That's someone else's job, and that if we try to understand, for example, people who are very different from us or from our audiences in our reporting, then we risk validating or platforming or legitimizing their beliefs, which is a very real challenge, right? But there would be some people who they just were allergic to the whole thing of trying to understanding being a goal, particularly because we are polarized, right? And so journalists are not exempt from the political high conflicts that we're in. They are feeling maybe more than most people. They are susceptible to high conflict because they consume a lot of news. And we know that consuming a lot of news tends to make you more anxious, more depressed, and consuming a lot of political news in particular makes you more polarized, and it leads to highly inaccurate views of your political other. So the other side. So it distorts your perception. So yeah, we did, in a word, yes, that was the experience.
I love it because when I started this, everyone thought it was a great idea, except for the animal rights, animal welfare groups.
Oh, interesting.
And we need to set precedent. We can't have any good case be settled and the people find a way to better treat the animals, because we need to set precedent so it happens again and again and again. And I said, I get it. I'm a litigator. I get it. Precedent is what happens. Legislation is a rule we put in place so people follow it.
Yep.
And if they don't buy in,
right,
it's
right.
They're going to get around it. They're
going to find a way. Yeah.
They're going to get around the legislation, or the people who enforce the legislation don't really believe in it either. Sort of like journalists, right? They really don't believe in that point of view. They really believe in this point of view.
Right.
So they might not do what they're supposed to do. And then you have to get them on board, and then you have to teach and educate them on why this is so much better. Where, like you did with the book High Conflict, you said, but wait a minute, let's take a minute and see if we just talk about how we're feeling right now, what might work, find a way to just change the way we look at something a little bit, and see how it works. And so, no, we're not going to get the brass ring the first time, and we're going to have fits and starts. Yet the animals are moving forward in the animal rights, animal welfare. They're recognizing that there's a different place for them in the world. They're recognizing that, look at companion animals now. 7 states have created legislation to treat them as something more than property, even though the 7 states still find pets as property. So it's this hybrid property that the judges, who have not really been given much direction, need to find the best interests of a pet in divorce. But what does that mean?
Right.
And what parameters do they work within? However, if you sent that same couple to mediation, and the mediator took a minute to say, okay, so tell me all about your relationship with Daisy.
Yeah.
And you just are in the room with the person, Gary is a big one. You cannot be caucusing. You need to be there listening and looking at the facial expressions. I'm a big collaborative mediator, because if I can't see that what Amanda's saying is in her eyes.
Yeah. You have to be in the room with both parties, ideally, right? Yeah.
Ideally, because then you can see that Amanda really is sincere when she's saying it. It's not the mediator coming in and saying, well, Amanda said this.
Right.
And Amanda would never say that because she's such a bleep, 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 bleep. And this is where we are and blah, blah, blah. And I don't trust her. So you build that trust.
Right.
Which is what the journalists would do too, if they took a moment to just say, well, let me look at this. When you were talking, I thought of confirmation bias. So what happens is you just keep going down the rabbit hole of confirmation bias, so that you know that everything you're writing
Right.
is correct, because
Right.
just keep seeing other people who you really trust and respect saying the same thing.
Right. It's the definition of an echo chamber. Yeah.
Oh, it really is frightening. It really is
Yeah.
frightening. So now you are very busy. So you wrote High Conflict, and I loved it that you went up on the Hill and tried to talk to some of the most high conflict people in the universe, our Congress and our Senate. And how did that go? That seemed to be really a lot of fun for you. I say that.
Actually, it was more fun than I would expect. I was sort of, yes, right. I mean, the expectation is, oh my gosh, this is just going to be performative, right? But the particular committee that I was asked to, it's not, the conflict entrepreneurs on the Hill are not the ones inviting me to testify, right?
Right.
So,
And they're
there's a
not
little,
listening to you. They're not sitting in the seats
no,
they were
they're
there,
not
right?
reading my books. They're not listening to you. So, like, it's a little bit of a selection bias. But the particular committee, which was the Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which was really interesting, was half Republican, half Democrat. And these are people who are trying to get Congress to function better. So, it's a very particular group of congressional members who, all of whom, this was the thing that was striking, all of whom seemed utterly miserable with the level of conflict in the system and didn't get into politics for this, didn't enjoy being hated and being also not being able to get anything done,
Right.
and
They are an anomaly, right? This group has been written about because they're really an anomaly.
well, in a way, yes, this committee got a lot of things done despite the
Right.
division and despite particularly after January 6th, the Democrats didn't want to be in the same room as the Republicans. So they had to, what they really did, they brought in a mediator and they had an off the record session, which never happens, right? I mean, it's amazing how unusual this was, to your point of being an anomaly. And they talked about their own personal experiences on January 6th, and they went around the room. And it changed the whole dynamic, because even though they obviously didn't suddenly agree on many things, they could see each other as complicated humans rather than caricatures. And so they were able to work together. But yeah, they were unusual. They tried and did make some progress to institutionalize some of what they did and to spread it around. But they're up against, what they'll tell you is it's the party leadership on both sides makes it very, very difficult to create normal routines that would make conflict healthy. So there's like no place where members of Congress across the aisle can meet without a camera, just normally. They don't sit, integrated in congressional hearings, except for in this committee. They sit on one side or the other, like just basic things that you would do in any kindergarten to make conflict healthy, they don't do. So
They sustain the conflict entrepreneur mindset.
yeah, and feed it and make it incentivized and exactly, yeah. So it doesn't have to be that way. I don't think it'll always be that way, but that's the trap that they're in. And it was interesting how much that session, and other people testified. Adam Grant from Wharton was there, and different people. And it was just striking how much it felt like a real brainstorming session. It didn't feel like we were just doing this for C-SPAN, even though C-SPAN was there. It felt like a genuine, like people were really sharing stories, these members, about like how trapped they felt by the conflict they were in. And I suspect it isn't that different from some of the clients you've had, right? Where they just feel like they want out of this conflict, but they don't know how to get out. So they feel trapped.
And often, if you, so you said a lot there, which was really important. And some of what I'm going to repeat is that they didn't go to the Hill to do this. They went to the Hill to get work done. They didn't go to the Hill to be partisan. They didn't go to the Hill to, be conflict entrepreneurs or to feed that, or they went to do something. Well, most of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I love, because when I go places, people go, God, this sounds so great. And when they go back, to the pit of iniquity, right?
Yeah.
How they feel like it's impossible because they're the only ones.
Yeah, right. And it's a very lonely place to be. Yeah.
Here they are with people who are supporting their better angels, right? You
Yeah.
and Grant support better angels, right? think about it. Try to find a way to find common ground instead of trying to always find what you disagree upon.
Yeah. Like,
Go ahead.
how can we just get things done? And some of that requires doing very counterintuitive things, right? I'm sure, like the story that you told me when we last talked, which we ended up making this fun, Instagram clip about, because you described it so perfectly about this, conflict between neighbors, and it just seems very binary. Like either the dog's got to go or I do, because the dogs are driving the lady crazy. And it turns out actually there's a third way. Like things often feel zero sum when they're not. Now whenever I say that, people say, but some things are zero sum. So I just want to, for all those people, I do want to say, yes, some things are zero sum, but far fewer than it feels like, And
unless you explore that possible third side that Bill Urey talks about all the time, you're always going to be me against you. I've got to be right over getting it right. It's the mindset we bring into the conversation.
Right. The mindset makes all these openings possible. So in that case, right, they figured out that actually the older lady next door could come let the dogs out, and she actually enjoyed that. So there was a way in which, you could just broaden the aperture on the whole conflict. So the dogs were happy, the neighbor was happy, the older lady was happy. And not everything works out that way, right? But usually there's something in there that if we can just get to it, we can find something useful here. Even if we never agree and never come to a resolution, right? Just understanding what is going on with this person can help humanize them and make it possible to see opportunities when they arise.
So you told the story in the Good Conflict platform, on the Good Conflict platform, about a crabby ant. And I thought it was great because you labeled it time travel. And I think that what we're talking about, even in Congress, if they would just time travel back to why they got into it, what they were doing, instead of staying stuck in this never-ending saga of den of iniquity, right? We're just following, we're little rats on a wheel. If you look back, you did a time travel. I'd love you to share that story because I thought it was a great story, and I immediately jumped on and commented because that is how I create contracts with people. So tell us, because it was so great.
Because you have them talk about, their relationship with the pet and why they're here, and widen their lens on the whole situation. Is that what you mean?
Well, we widen the lens when we make contracts for breed. When I make a contract for a breeder with a new owner, we widen the lens and memorialize how we feel today, why we're here today, the boundaries we want, the expectations we have, how we're going to communicate. We memorialize that so that when you stop talking to me the way I think you should,
we can come back to that.
We can go back to that.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of shorter time travel, but it's still travel back to what our expectations were, how we memorialized it, and what did we do to maybe take a fork in the road we weren't supposed to, and how do we come back?
Right. Like, how do we get from A to B to C? So I was talking about for people who are maybe dreading an upcoming family holiday dinner. Most of us have someone in our families that we disagree with quite profoundly about politics or other things right now. And usually the default is to just not talk about it, which sometimes is the right call. But it's also a lost opportunity because there's some chance that you could both learn something that would be valuable to you, but you have to do it in the right way and do it with care. So one of the ways that we were suggesting people can bring this mindset that we're talking about to their holiday dinner is to come with some questions that they could ask folks at the dinner table, maybe the crabby aunt, maybe the crazy uncle, whatever, to ask that get them out of their present or their dread about the future and get them doing some time travel in their own history and sharing a story. And maybe it's something about who was your first crush? What happened? And maybe it's a story about, what's something like, do you remember the first time you voted? Like, if we do want to go to politics, when did you first vote? Like, how did you decide who to vote for? What did that feel like? So we're not going to litigate immediately this current election, but what are your memories of it? And what you see is that people, not everything in the world is complicated, but people are complicated. And so when you see them try to remember and tell stories around their own history and do so outside of the current trenches that they're in, you see a kind of, three-dimensional person in front of you that you might not otherwise.
And I want to bring us back to what you really started with, which was most of the time, blame is what Gary told you when you were in training. Blame is vulnerability. And a lot of times when we have these difficult conversations, we might be saying something that someone is feeling we're blaming them or we're questioning them. And so they're going to really resist and become, as Brene Brown put, armor up. They're going to armor up because they are vulnerable. They don't know the answer, or maybe they agree, but they can't agree because then it would make no sense why they were doing.
Right.
And so they can't agree. And I have a sister who is definitely in that category. And I often wonder what you do when there's just so much, and this happens in all sorts of arenas, when there's just so much fear and vulnerability that you can't have a conversation. How do you come around? Because I think that's something that you speak about beautifully in Good Conflict, especially with the people who you interviewed who actually got out of serious difficulties, and some began their lives anew from gangs. And how did they do that? There's a skill about recognizing that you're being triggered, recognizing that they're triggering you because they're feeling vulnerable, and deciding.
Yeah, and I think it's a skill you really have to practice in a low stakes setting many, many times, right? Like you can't just do it in the moment. But Curtis Toller, who's the person that you mentioned, who was a gang leader in Chicago for many years and now does very powerful work interrupting gang violence at a place called Chicago Cred. He taught me, we invited him to DC to speak to high-level political staffers. And it was so interesting because I asked him, what would you do about political violence in the United States, which has gone up significantly? We just are seeing really alarming levels of threats against judges, members of Congress, election officials, the kind of thing you see in very violent countries that, in Mexico this election year, 37 candidates were killed. And that's not what we want, so we don't want to get used to it. That's not what we've ever experienced. Right. I mean, we've had political violence, but we typically, the fact that there were 2 attempts, we know about on Donald Trump's life, it's not a coincidence.
This is intolerable.
And we can't get used to this, nor should we accept it. To your point, it's not tolerable. So what I asked him was, how would you start to interrupt that violence? Because I actually think it's very similar to gang violence. The behavior is very similar. And he said, the first thing you need to do is lower the threat level. So this goes back to your point about when there's so much fear, it's very hard, impossible for people to be vulnerable or to admit what they don't know or to admit that they changed their mind or whatever. So lowering the threat level. And so what does that look like? For some, depends on your sphere of influence. For some people, it means literally turning down the volume, removing conflict entrepreneurs from your cable TV news feed or your social media feed, right? Or, just not. Sometimes we have friends and loved ones who we agree with about politics, but they're constantly sending us outrage, right? Or reasons to be upset or afraid. And, is that serving you? Or should you turn down the volume on that part of the relationship? So start with your own head and how can you turn down the threat level? And then how can you turn down the threat level in the groups where you have influence, whether it's your church or your synagogue or your neighborhood? What can you do? Like this weekend, for example, I'm going to a training for de-escalating violence with weapons at election sites in DC. Because, unfortunately, that's usually in hyper-polarized country, political violence goes up right around a big national election. And I'm not doing that because I necessarily expect to encounter violence at an election site in DC, but more because this is how we learn, right, to turn down the threat level, even in ourselves. Is like, this isn't inevitable and there's nothing we can do. Do I wish that, we weren't so well armed, that this was a as a society that this is something we have to worry about? Yes, but here's where we are. So what are the skills we can all work on so that we can lower that threat level in ways that are healthy?
It's amazing because that is exactly what I would have thought would be the work we would do to educate ourselves. I told you he's calling the dogs to go outside.
I don't even hear him.
Good. Okay.
But I feel like that's an important part of your podcast.
It is an important part of the podcast.
It's ambient noise. That's like an NPR when you hear like the trains going by and a story about train.
That's exactly right. Maybe I'll leave it in then. But what you're learning about and what you're experiencing is the kind of thing that enables you to then bring it home and de-escalate the conflicts in your life,
in your home and in your street and in your grocery store. Yeah.
It's the kind of thing. I did a group for the AVMA on diffusing conflict, and I worked with them and answered their questions. I didn't necessarily go through the PowerPoint because you know what, you can go through the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
A lot of information on slides, even though you're not supposed to, so that you know what I'm trying
to.
And when I finished, one of the girls got up and said, but you didn't talk about how to fire staff members.
Oh.
And I sat there and I said, well, tell me a little bit more, Gary,
yeah.
Tell me a little bit more. Said, well, I need to how to fire staff. You only talked about how to, keep clients happy and, keep staff members happy. How do I fire them? And I said, well, here's my number, call me up. And maybe if you do the things that we talked about today, you might not have to fire the staff member.
Right. Wouldn't that be nice?
Wouldn't that be nice? Because that costs you a lot of money. So it being able to recognize, especially in this polarized society, I laugh because you're going to do that. I'm working an election site here in North Carolina because I've never been involved in politics before, but now I'm working. Because I decided that I would get involved. I would really, learn something new every day, and hopefully bring some of the skills like you will.
I was just about to say, you can use all your conflict de-escalation skills.
Yeah, to have the parties really communicate with each other and as Gary would say, do a lot more active listening than active talking.
Yeah, right.
And don't you think that would help? I'm sure that Curtis does a lot of listening.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because half of what people want in conflict is just to be heard, right? And if you can do that for people and show them you heard them beyond a doubt by trying to distill what they said into your own language and play it back to them, as Gary taught us to do, the looping technique, and then check if you got it right, then they can see that you're really trying to get them and they feel less alone and they feel less afraid, right? Just like that, it can happen in a minute. You've seen it happen, I've seen it happen, and that does lower the threat level as well. So I'm glad you mentioned that because that's a really good way to help people lower their guard just a little bit so that we can get to what is this really about? Like, what do you really need? And let some other stuff go.
And I find, and probably you find, there are a lot of times when I have a lot to say and the little Gary voice in the back of my head said,
yeah,
leave it here.
Yeah, right. Like he taught me those 3 rules he uses with himself. Does it need to be said? Like a litmus test. Does it need to be said? Does it need to be said by me? And does it need to be said by me right now? And it's amazing how often when I remember to use those rules, the answer is no. It might be yes, yes, and then no, but it often ends at no.
Because you know what? Sometimes if you don't say, Amanda, this is what I'm hearing you say, and say what Amanda says, and then say, and I'd like you to consider this, it sometimes shuts down the ability for what you have just had them articulate to you.
Yeah.
Have them think about it a little deeper. And maybe the next time you come back together, they'll go, I really thought about what I said and maybe blah, blah, blah. And you'll have an opening then. Sometimes the better form of valor is to fight another day.
Right. So you're saying that the effects of looping might actually happen days later, weeks later, because now people are Chris Voss, the former hostage negotiator, he has a great explanation. He does a form of looping, right? And he basically says, you're helping people listen to what they're saying. Like,
and self-correct.
Yeah, like, because once you hear it articulated by someone else, you're like, well, okay, that's partly true, but also it's this other thing, and it's not quite this. And then I realize, I mean, it's happened to me so many times where we'll lead a looping training with good conflict, and people will say, oh my God, I was talking, they were looping me, and I realized something about this I never realized. Just from that iterative back and forth of trying to get to the root, feeling or experience.
And I'm going to hear the words you say based on the experiences and biases I have,
right.
which may not at all be how you meant it.
Right.
And that's usually what happens with my owners and my breeders, right? When they get down the road, they have a whole different definition of what was in the touchstone.
Interesting.
Bother to go back and read it.
Right.
Till I drag them back to read it. And then they go, oh, wait, I'm thinking differently than I did then, and
right.
expectations were set, and it puts you back on a little bit more firm footing.
Huh. That's so interesting. Yeah, and having that ritual of going back to it creates a little pause in the conflict, which is so valuable.
Time travel.
Time travel, yeah. And before we wrap up, I have one question I'd love to ask you if it's okay.
Sure.
So I have this fantasy, like I travel a lot for work, but I really want to get a dog, but I also want to be fair to the dog, right? And so is it insane for me to think you could do a dog share, like you and another family, and you draw up all the terms, we hire Deborah, only the best, and we come up with our like story and what we're going to do and not do, and we have a process. And do you think that's possible, or is that a dream?
I always think that if you go into it with the boundaries and the expectations set and you check in, that's the most important piece.
Yeah, checking in.
And I think that a pet can go back and forth. Some animal behaviorists would say never, no way. And I said, it's up to the pet. Some pets do well, some pets don't do well. I had a couple who had a dog, and one guy was a mountain climber and river rafter and blah, blah. And the dog was with him and was riding the river raft and climbing mountains. And his ex walked on a leash. And the dog was happy with both of them. In fact, he probably said, oh, thank God, I can have a rest now. I don't have to climb those blessed mountains anymore. and he loved it.
Country, right?
Exactly. So as long as, and quite frankly, except for the expense of trying to find someone or have someone nearby, which I know about because I have 2 dogs.
Yeah.
Have someone close by who you trust that can watch the dog if you travel.
Yeah.
Sharing is the next best thing. However, when divorced couples can't agree, or one's moving and, going to be away from the dog, or they're going to take the dog and then you don't have the dog, and none of this was talked about before because God forbid we do that. I always say, well, you're going to go on vacation, right? Yeah. So why can't you have the pet during vacation? So if you have, what I would suggest you do is, if you have lots of friends who have pets, say, listen, when you go on vacation this summer, if it jibes with my schedule, can I watch Sparky for you?
Okay.
And then you have Sparky for a week, or maybe, a summer if they go to Montauk or to East Hampton or wherever they go.
Yeah.
So, or just a week. Because I find that if I can get, ex couples to recognize that Sparky would rather be with Amanda than to be in a kennel or, with somebody they don't know, put your big girl and big boy pants on, to share the dog at that time. It's really in the best interest of the pet. And if you think about the best interest of the pet. So what I would suggest is you have a lot of fun.
Okay, I like this.
If you're jonesing for a dog or a cat, say to them, listen, if you're going away, let me know. And, and I'll watch them and see how it goes. I mean, it may be overwhelming for you to watch the cat, and you might be so worried, or watch the dog. Laugh because I just flew home from New York yesterday with my son's cat, who will stay here now for 3 months because he's traveling. And so that's why it popped into my brain. I'm like, if they're going away, people go away.
It
holidays.
takes a village. Yeah.
It takes a village. And if you're it could be your neighbor that you remember the lady next door.
Right.
You could be the
Right.
lady
That's
next door.
right. Right. Could be the lady next door. That's
So,
funny.
oh, Amanda, I'm so glad you asked that question because it was such a perfect wrap up. It's about having that conversation and
Yeah.
listening. And some people might jump at the chance. And you have to feel comfortable. So, as you said, you have to find somebody to help write up the touchstone and the agreement so that
Yeah.
you know what you have to do, you know what their expectations are, they know what your expectations are. But absolutely, I think that sharing a pet is something that can be done if everybody is pays attention. What usually happens is, oh yeah, I'll share a pet with you, Amanda, no worries, and
Right.
nothing's discussed. And then
Right.
suddenly, well, you're keeping the dog for a month at a time and giving it to me for a week. That wasn't really what we thought. Well, it likes
Right.
me better, right? So, and that might be what it is, and you have to revisit. So
Mm-hmm.
happy to
Yeah.
help you. If you ever find your, family or friends who are saying, "Oh yeah, Amanda, here," um,
Okay.
you'll save them thousands of dollars in
Yeah.
kenneling fees or in dog sitter fees.
Yeah.
You'll get the taste of having a pet, and believe
Yeah.
me,
I love this idea. I'm going to do this.
it's addictive. We have a neighbor down the street who takes all the neighbor dogs when you're on vacation. She
Oh,
just
nice.
neighbor dog. That's all she does. She doesn't have a dog herself, but she takes all the neighbors' little white dogs. Everybody has a little white dog. A big red dog. I don't have a little white dog.
Uh-huh.
But Amanda Ripley, thank you so much. I want everyone to go to Good Conflict on Instagram, on LinkedIn. It has these little vignettes that just have you think about what good conflict is and how it does create that, like Amanda and I now are working every day to have that little voice in our head say, wait a minute, let me listen. Let me not jump to conclusions. Maybe let me come back. Amanda, tell us where we can get in touch with you if you'd like, or if there's anything else you want to add, because I can tell you I'm addicted to good conflict.
Oh, thank you so much, Deborah. Yeah, you can find all of our resources. We have a bunch of free downloads and other materials at thegoodconflict.com. And you can also find us on
And you have
Instagram and
trainings
LinkedIn and
too,
all the
right?
places.
You
What's
have
that?
training. You have trainings as
We have
well.
trainings. We actually, thank you for reminding me, we have a brand new self-paced digital masterclass that'll be released later this month that we're very excited about. So that's like all our best stuff and in little, less than 5-minute videos, but like a full, 6-module program for people who really want to learn to lead and stay sane in an age of volatile conflict. So yeah, check it out.
Absolutely. Well, this is Deborah Hamilton. You're on Why Do Pets Matter? We were everywhere and we talked about pets. So thank you, Amanda Ripley. And until I see you again, kiss your pets for me.